Welcome to the CEO series. Our guest today is Lars Schmidt, CEO and founder of Amplify, author of Redefining HR. And we will be discussing this tremendous book throughout today. So Lars is the founder of Amplify. It's an HR executive search and consulting firm. He's spent over 20 years in the industry working for a wide range of global companies. He's a writer at Fast Company. He's a co-author of Employee Branding for Dummies and the host of the Redefining HR podcast. He was named the top 100 influencers by HR Examiner and included in Huffington Post's top 100 social HR experts on Twitter. Named to top 50 recruiting influencers by LinkedIn. What more do you need with all that? Thank you, Lars, for being a guest.
I think what I need is a shorter bio.
No, that's cool. That's cool. It just qualifies you. So glad to have you on. I've been following your book launch, and it's been amazing. The social media exposure you've had over the past couple of weeks. Is it a couple of weeks now?
So the book launched globally last Tuesday, so about a week and a half now of it being out in the wild. It was pre-released in the UK because my publisher is out of London. Okay. So they got a sneak peek, but everybody globally has had it for about a week and a half.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about redefining HR. You know, I love the way I took a photo of this. Your chapters are phenomenal because basically what you do in your chapters is basically capture every facet of the organization and HR's role in walking through that. So we'll discuss this a little later. So walk us through the thought process of writing the book. I mean, how long was that in the making, and why do we need another HR book?
Yeah. It's a fair question. I think for me, the book really started probably about 5 years ago, not writing it, but thinking about it. And what happened around that time was the combination of a couple things. So I was co-founded HR Open Source with my friend Ambrosia Vertesi. We were building that into a global community and a network around, accelerating innovation in HR. And so through that, we had the opportunity to travel the world and go to events and meet with lots of practitioners to learn what were some of their barriers to, progressive HR practices. And so I started thinking more about it then. Then I, wrote the co-authored Employee Branding for Dummies. Then I started writing for Forbes, covering modern HR and work practices. Then I started writing for Fast Company, and that led to the podcast. And so all of those things cumulatively, I was okay, I have all of these thoughts on what modern HR looks like now and what it can be at its best. And I have, episodes or articles or little things here and there that illuminate a small part of it, but I needed to have a cohesive story around what it looked like, as you mentioned, that table of contents, something that really covered all of the aspects, and not even all because it's such a broad field, but the majority of the aspects of modern HR, and that's what led to the book. Okay,
modern HR. So I read an article here a while back. They were talking about the crisis of COVID. Yeah. And the way they referenced it, they said that the 2007-2008 financial crisis was brought back to fruition by CFOs and financial teams. And they said the COVID experience is going to be brought back by HR teams and the influence they will play in this reimagining HR as well as reimagining the workforce. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? The role that we play now.
Yeah, I think it's essential, right? I think we went through something, meaning collectively we in HR, we went something last year that none of us have ever experienced. None of us have ever gone through. And so, our ability to shift our businesses to remote work seemingly overnight for many of us, those of us who have an employee population that was able to work remotely, navigating through all of the turmoil to the business, right? Lots of businesses struggled to survive, and so, guiding thoughtful reductions or creative ways that you might be able to do different things and not have to let headcount go in order to reduce costs, to kind of weather that storm. There's so many things and so many areas where HR had to step up for their business's very survival. And I think it certainly shined a light on the difference between great HR and legacy HR in terms of the companies that were able to navigate that successfully and kind of maintain their their teams, their culture, their business on the other side. And I say on the other side, we're not on the other side, but we're we're moving through it. We've kind of reestablished our operating rhythms based on our current reality. And so I think it definitely pushed the role of HR, and more specifically the CHRO or Chief People Officer, into the spotlight as one of the most important executives in the C-suite.
Yeah, well, should be the most important executive in the C-suite, because so when you think of legacy HR had probably a legacy leader, and then you're talking about the CHRO that we're talking about. That's a totally different type leader. So walk us through the CHRO dynamic and how that's transitioned, and what should all of that thought process be anchored in?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that if you look at the CHRO today and the profile, and again, I'll kind of weave between CHRO, Chief People Officer, Head of People. The titles will vary. The role, the top HR role, it's very much a business operator that's focused on people and the level of complexity. And people might say, well, HR has always been a business function, and CHROs have always had to have business acumen. You have, but not quite at the level that you do now with the complexity that you do, because you have to understand, it's one of the really unique jobs in the C-suite, because HR acumen alone isn't enough. You have to understand the P&L and the financials like a CFO. You have to understand the go-to-market strategy and revenue and deal pipeline like a Chief Revenue Officer or Head of Sales. You have to understand market positioning and organizational threats and competitors like a CMO. And now you have to also understand all those things and really be aware of the business strategy of the organization, and then be able to translate that to a people strategy and a nuanced people strategy that accounts for all of those variables while you're overseeing the most volatile asset a company has, which is your people. So it's a really difficult job, but it's very much rooted in business. And I think if you look at the profile of the CHRO has evolved specifically over the last 5 years, where you're finding more and more people coming into that role from other areas of the business, where in the past it was much more of an insular position, right? The career field within HR in general tended to be really insular. You came up and you worked your way up to that top spot. Now that still happens, but there's tons of examples of people moving into the field of HR from other areas of the business. And I think it's making us much better.
Yeah. In theory, it should. So let's look at it this way. So a CHRO that has those capabilities, and maybe you come into an organization and you inherit a team that's a legacy team. Yeah. So that's a challenge, but the HR BP model has been around a long time. As a matter of fact, next week, Dave Aldrich is on the show. The HR BP model, and then you're talking about this new level CHRO. How can we blend those two together? And I'm going to say upskill, reskill those HR BPs or the people in that area.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's interesting. A lot of organizations, especially after last year, CEOs and executive teams and boards are much more kind of cognizant of the difference between great HR and legacy HR. And so they know that they need those capabilities. It's a mistake to think that you can just have an entirely legacy-oriented organization, plug in a progressive CHRO, and everything is just going to change overnight. Like, you gotta, it's that hire, it's the budget, it's the resources, it's the support, it's kind of giving that person what they need and getting out of their way, like removing roadblocks so they can do the work. So that's kind of the first piece. I think when it comes to upskilling a team, the good thing is that there's never been a better time for career development in HR. In the past, we had to rely on, organizations like SHRM or, CEB or Person, and, not to, those are all fine organizations, but they're gated. You need to have a budget to have access. They tend to be, because they're so big, they have a hard time, building content and practices for today's time, rather than leaning on their library of yesterday's resources. And so now you have, whether it's HR open source, hacking HR, Google Rework, Disrupt HR. I mean, there's tons of different communities and platforms and resources that are no cost for practitioners, where they can level up their skills and they can see what their peers are doing. So I think that in terms of being able to tap into those types of resources from an education and development standpoint, there's never been a better time to HR. I think specifically to your question on that CHRO coming into that legacy team, first they have to understand the business priorities, right? And like, what are the business priorities over the next 2 to 3 years? What are the risks to the business? Then they have to assess kind of where they are on some of their core HR and people team competencies and prioritize how they up-level the team and the skills based on where the business needs those proficiencies the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So business acumen, connecting that to people strategy. So I run sessions across the globe, as you know, and sometimes I ask that question of how many people in the room can write down your organization's strategy, and I get that kind of blank look. And there's in these days and times, you have to be able to do exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
you have to be able to connect those two. So business strategy, people strategy, and then you connect all this together. And on the business outcome side, there's the whatever the business outcome would be in growing the business. So my question is, and Lori mentioned this last week. She called it the University of YouTube. The University of the Internet, in trying to upskill without waiting for someone to send you off to a session. So is it has HR in this kind of department should be on high alert for upskilling on their own, driving that themselves, owning your own HR career?
100%. Like, I think learning agility is probably one of the most important skill sets for a modern HR operator. And you have to take the initiative to find those opportunities, to find that inspiration and those resources and case studies and whatever it might be. If as a practitioner, if you're waiting for your boss to send you to a conference, a seminar, or whatever, like you're going to get passed by really quickly with how quickly things are evolving. You have to have that initiative. My hack that I recommend any HR practitioner at any level, and frankly, probably any employee, this isn't just limited to HR, is at a bare minimum, carve out an hour in your schedule every week, block it in your calendar, defend it, do not let people book over it, and that's your learning time. And in that time, every week we have people sending us, articles. We see something that looks interesting on Twitter. We see something getting shared around our organization. Maybe we don't have time to read it at that time. Save that somewhere, and in that learning time, go back and read it. Take notes. Keep those notes. And so, absolutely, I think that the world is becoming just more complex, more dynamic. If we're not finding ways to keep up with what's happening, we're going to find ourselves outdated pretty quickly.
Exactly. In your book, you talk about HR professionals critically assessing their current processes and activities to identify what's needed. So you talked about a two-pronged process.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what you have to do especially for a leader, there's so much you can do in HR. There's so many programs, there's so much technology, as billions of dollars of venture capital being poured in the HR tech space.
Yeah.
There's no limit to what you can do. There should be limits to what you should do and what the business needs you to do. And so that kind of becomes the art in terms of prioritizing your projects. You have to understand, and again, this kind of comes back to the business acumen, but you have to understand what the business's needs are and how the HR and people team is organized to support those needs. And that should be how you prioritize your own program. So, yes, it would be great to have a better talent management program. Yes, it would be great to have a better learning program. Yes, it would be better to have a great employer brand on the front end of our recruiting efforts. Like, all those things are great. And in a perfect world of unlimited time and resources, you can do all of them. Nobody lives in that world. So you have to be able to prioritize based on what your business needs and expects from you. And I think, I only use the term seat at the table when I'm mocking it, but when it comes to like building that credibility with the executive team, if you do that and you're saying, hey, in Q1 and Q2, we're focusing in these areas because I know organizationally, these are the things that we're going after, and this is how our team can support that. That's business acumen. That's demonstrating business value to the organization, that's how you need to be prioritizing your programs.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about the business acumen, the business person side, I think back to Starbucks. We're in the people business, but we just happen to serve coffee. So I always tell people, try and be perceived as a business person first.
Yeah.
But your specialty just happens to sit in human resources.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah. So the other key point so we talked about the organization, the leadership, CHRO teams. What about boards? So we're talking about redesigning HR, and if we were to take 1 point out of 11 here and tie that into a talent management strategy, how do we make a business case for the new version of human resources to a legacy team or a legacy board?
So I think you have to approach your board and say, what is it you expect from this business? I always find comparative analysis can be a motivating factor for boards and executive teams.
Yeah.
Like, what are your competitors doing? What do they have that you don't? How are they structured that you're not? And then kind of be able to present that and be like, okay, well, X company is doing this, this, and this. Y company is doing this, 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 and this. We're doing this. So you want us to compete with them. You want us to overtake them on the market. You want us to obviously outperform them. Give us the tools to do that. If you're serious about making that commitment, you need to make the commitment to the people, team, and programs and fund it in a way that will allow us to compete on that same level. And so that comparative analysis, especially in legacy environments where they don't necessarily know what great HR looks like. They've never worked in those environments. It's funny, when I wrote the book, my publisher was like, great, is this an HR book? I'm like, no, this is a business book. Yes, it's focused on HR and people operations, but it's a business book. And my goal is not just for HR executives and operators to read this. I want CEOs to read this. I want board members to read this. I want C-suite peers to read this, to see practical examples of what great HR looks like. Because ultimately, no matter how passionate and inspired and motivated and competent and creative your CHRO is, if they don't have the buy-in from their CEO and from the leadership team to actually fund and support and empower those programs, they're going to be limited. And so really, it's not just HR in a vacuum is not enough to unlock that potential. It's got to be supported and empowered by the boards, by the C-suite. And so, yeah, I think, comparative analysis, and then give them this book to read it. That's my only plugging, right? If I'm an author, I have to at least make one plug in there. But I think that the book will open their mind, especially if they've never worked in progressive organizations with great HR teams. It'll show them what's possible. And I'd imagine in seeing that, they're gonna be like, well, why don't we do that? How do we build that? How do we have those kind of outcomes for our business?
Okay. So from reading through some of the comments about your book, you interviewed quite a few people from progressive organizations, quite a few progressive CHROs, which I think is helpful, because if you're talking about what are we doing versus what someone else is doing, if they see what another company is doing and the business outcome, it makes a better argument, so to speak.
Yeah.
Connecting that. So talk about some of the people that you interviewed for this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think, actually, I'll tie that back to one of your probably your first question is, why do we need another HR book? I think when you look at the landscape at HR books, a lot of the books that are out there, they're written by, analysts, they're written by, pundits, academics, and those are all great profiles, and they're way smarter than me, and they have a very detailed analysis in the book. I didn't want to write that book. I wanted to actually write a book for practitioners, by practitioners. It was packed full of real stories from real people doing the work, so that I could use my experience to frame the chapter and how we think about things from the context of modern HR and how that's different from legacy HR. But then every chapter is packed full of case studies and personal narratives and essays from CPOs and CHROs and business leaders actually doing the work, because I want it to be relatable for practitioners, but also wanted to give them something they could be like, hey, maybe I can do that. Hey, I didn't know to think about this in that way. That's something that I can do in my organization. So those empowering them with real takeaways, I think is really important. So when you look at how that comes together, a lot of the conversations actually stemmed from the podcast. So anybody from, Katie Burke at HubSpot, Anna Binder at Asana, Jerry Doris at Delivery Hero, Claude Silver at VaynerMedia, David Hanrahan at Eventbrite. I mean, there's so many great leaders who, through the podcast, I've had the privilege of having conversations with and learning from. And so when it came to writing the book, there are so many people who I've already, learned about how they do things differently and kind of what they're overcoming and what the results are, and in some cases what they're screwing up. And so the book is kind of bringing those stories to life.
Okay. I talked with a executive search firm friend of mine, talking about CHROs and what companies are looking for. And he gave me kind of a unique perspective. He says, it's either going to be number one or number two. Number one is they're looking for a legacy person, just keep the trains running on time. Or they may have transitions that we need a more strategic leader in doing that. So there still seems to be, from a lot of organizations, from what he says, is that they're still looking for someone just to come in and make sure everything is done.
Yeah.
Which I find disheartening. because when you talk about, I'm just saying, when you talk about the proverbial seat at the, those people aren't going to sit in that room. No. Whereas the people on the other side are going to sit in that room.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I view it, we tend to, homogenize HR, and not we internally, like the outside world, people outside of HR, they paint HR with one brush. HR is this, HR is that. And the reality is HR is a spectrum. And so I talk about this a little bit in the book, but the way that I view the field of HR is, and this is anecdotal based on my experience, so don't ask me for the data behind this, I don't have it. But the top edge, and this is mostly where I focus on the book, the top edge of the field of HR and people operations is probably about 10% of the overall field, right? Those are the organizations, leading, high performing, deeply integrated with the executive team, involved in every strategic decision for the company, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side of that, bell curve, if you will, is probably 20% and that's like personnel, transactional HR, reactive, administrative, no authority, no cloud business, right? That's where a lot of the stereotypes and stigmas around HR come. And then there's probably about 70% in the middle, and that middle, so that's the bulk of the field. And where they are in that curve depends on a variety of factors. But ultimately, they have the ability to get to modern HR. They have the desire to get to modern HR, and a lot of the blockers that they have to overcome to get there are in the C-suite. Are in the founding team, who they've never experienced it. They don't know they don't know what transformative HR can do for the business. So they're fine just keeping the trains running on time and all of that. I don't spend any time in that world. I observe it, but I don't spend time there. My kind of, my personal mission is to really shine a spotlight on that 10% and make their practices more accessible so that 70% can start to move in that direction.
Yeah. One of the things I find that from people that I've worked with, it's a younger audience who is thirsting to be in that 10% organization, who are doing the things that they would want to be a part of. Because sometimes I come across others who are stuck on the other side, the legacy side, and they're looking to do everything they possibly can do to get out. So they come to me, they get the skills to do it, but then they go back and they're right back into the same organization. And you never want to tell people just try to find another job to go do what you need to do. But I say, let it be driven by what you want. If you want to do more of that, you're going to have to find an organization that will allow you to do that.
Yeah.
So 2 weeks the book has been out. You sold out your first pile. They're refurbishing everything, bringing in a whole new supply. What feedback have you gotten from people in our profession or from throughout that you found intriguing? That was, I really didn't think this was going to be maybe this important.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I thought the book would resonate with readers. In a lot of ways, I kind of wrote the book that I wish I had when I was earlier in my career, with lots of tangible, stories and practices and examples and just relatable context, as opposed to a kind of a clinical outside observation on the field. I want an observation from the inside out. which is really what I was aiming to do with the book. I think one of the things that maybe surprised me was I've heard from a couple academics and professors who teach HR courses, and they've reached out of the blue. Like one was somebody who I know, others were people that I did not know that just kind of reached out to me on LinkedIn, thanking me for writing the book and kind of giving them something that they can finally bring to students that's a more tangible and kind of inspiring view on the field that they want to pursue. They were like, we haven't had that, like the books that we would have to go through, or that they didn't have lots of examples, or they were very legacy in their orientation. This is something that is it's inspiring, it's progressive, it's relatable, and that I felt that the readers as practitioners, people doing the work now, would respond in that way. But it was nice to kind of hear that even from an academia standpoint of professors who will start using the book to actually teach their students on what HR looks like today. Okay.
Are you planning workshops around redefining HR? Is that in the plans? I look at it this way. Is that in the plans to take it on the road and do maybe a 2-day workshop or advanced level workshop, or however you brand it?
So
post-COVID.
So short answer is yes. Exactly what that looks like, I'm not ready to unveil yet because it's being built. But I'm getting ready to launch a new stealth project that'll be unveiled at some point later this year that I think will do just that. So I'm really excited about it.
Okay, cool. Let me know because we need.
I think this is the first show I've mentioned that is something that I'm actually going to be building. So. Okay,
cool. Yeah, that would be great. I teach a course here in Dubai at American University in the Emirates, and I find working with students. So these are graduate students who are coming out with degrees, master's degree in organizational development. And I want to do as much as I can to get them on the right track. I don't want them to come out and get stuck. And you know how it is when you get in these organizations and you hate Monday mornings because it's the stuff that you're dealing with to go through that. So thank you for that. And I'm glad that you're telling the audience that something will be coming out, to take it to the next level. So if I'm a leader within an organization and maybe I inherited a team, and we talked about this before, what would your advice be for someone who's interviewing to go into an organization to take over? Maybe the legacy leader is leaving. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give them to start reskilling that team? Yeah, to make sure they have the bandwidth to do all these things they want to do.
Yeah, so I would. So two things. One, I would go back to that point earlier around like making sure you're spending some time early on understanding the business objectives and goals, and what are the different kind of elements of HR and people operations that are most critical to supporting those goals. So just from a focus standpoint, that those are the projects you're going after. I think making that vision of what you're building very clear to the team and saying, here's what we're building, here's how I want to support all of you in getting there, here's what I'm going to expect from you in order for us to get there. And then, I'm a big believer in a leader coming in, especially in that scenario where you're trying to kind of at scale upskill a legacy team, set clear expectations and say, this is my vision, this is what we're going for. Are you on board? Like, do you opt into this? And some people aren't going to be ready for that journey. They're going to want to, create a severance package, give people who don't buy into that the opportunity to leave, because it's actually difficult if you have people who are, and some people don't want to work in those environments. Some people just want to transact. That's fine. There's environments for them. But if that's not the environment you're building, give them that opportunity to say, that's not really what I want to be doing or the environment I want to work in. Give them a package, treat them well, but let them move on. And then build the team around that capability that you're trying to build, and create, let everybody know it's going to be a culture of learning and development and growth, and you're going to be in it together. So that you can, because that change can also be scary, right? If you're somebody who's been doing things a certain way for years and years and years, now you have somebody coming in like, we're doing this thing over here now. Most humans won't, won't just be like, great, we're going to completely blow up everything I've done for years and do something entirely new. So help them along in that journey, but give them an off-ramp as well. I think that it's much more productive to your team if there's people that don't buy into your vision, if they have the opportunity to kind of opt out as opposed to begrudgingly staying on and potentially at worst, sabotaging your efforts.
Yeah, I run into that situation, and I had a young lady that worked for me. She says, no, please don't put me up front. I don't want to do that. I'll do all the calculations. She was in comp and ben. I'll do all the calculations and give them to you, but please, I'm afraid to do that. Which I was fine with that. Yeah. So school me as to what I need to do, but I need your research capabilities. So it's kind of like, and I think what I'm getting from you is that each person may bring something a little different to the table, and you see whether that could fit into this mosaic that you're trying to build.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, not everybody, people talk about, especially when you look at how, diverse the field of HR is. And I mean, diverse just from a role standpoint. There's data analytics, there's employer branding, there's, evangelism to some extent in terms of what the CHRO and some of the leaders will do. Inclusion teams, there's so many different facets of HR, and the skill set for one does not necessarily just plug into the skill set for the other. So there's rooms for extroverts, there's rooms for introverts, there's room for data crunchers who just want to work with numbers, there's rooms for creative people who just want to do design and brand and marketing work. So there's a space for every profile. You just have to make sure that you kind of have people in roles that suit not just their strengths and their capabilities, but their interests. And you can't gauge that from a resume, from an employee file. You really need to actually get to know that person a bit, and that's the human side of human resources, if you will.
Yeah. So what are your eighth chapter is the rise of EX. So you and Lori were on a webinar a while back for SAP, and we were talking about EX. So give us some insights on the rise of employee experience. That is your eighth chapter.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that the term employee experience is actually fairly new to HR when you look at some of the other facets like recruiting and performance and learning and all those kind of core components. Employee experience to me is really how you think about all of the aspects of how an employee interacts in the workplace, from physical space back when we had those, to how work gets done, tools, resources, benefits, perks, all of those things that performance, all of those things can be lumped in. There's different ways to view it. Mark Levy, who is one of the pioneers of employee experience, he actually uses that term he doesn't use HR at all. He uses employee experience to talk about the whole function holistically. I think others use employee experience as a subset of overall HR. So there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to look at it. But I think it's how we think about how we support the entire employee experience as opposed to just a specific element of the employee lifecycle.
I've often said, if you look at finance and you look at human resources, so finance presents a certain way. They talk about from to, they talk about the gaps, they talk about trends and all those kinds of things. So I tell HR people, when you're presenting, speak in the same language, so to speak.
Yeah. So
if you think of employee experience, could we possibly use the same kind of wording or that the customer experience department uses? Could we overlay some of that customer experience and the data behind that and look at our 1,500 employees?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we're starting to do that now. If you look at something like an NPS score, NPS scores were typically the domain of marketing, and marketers, and now we're using those to measure our candidate experience. We're using that to measure our employee engagement scores, and so, our ability to kind of be a bit more sophisticated and data oriented around how we present, trends on the business. I think, again, that's one of those kind of business acumen, core components of HR leadership. So when you can come to those C-suite meetings and your CFO is presenting their data and your chief revenue officer is talking about the sales metrics and IT team is talking about uptime and downtime and you can have that kind of data as well as it relates to the health of your organization. I think we're going to even start to see more organizations look at how they're quantifying culture, quantifying, we've always done employee engagement, but I think getting a little bit more granular in that, so that we understand not just the pulse of the business, but we understand how the things that we do and the programs that we launch impact that health up or down, so that we know, okay, we should roll out this new benefit. Well, we know by our data that X percent of our employees are actually interested in that. So yes, it might be trendy. Yes, everybody might be talking about like this is the next must-have benefit for HR, but we know with our population that they're not going to take advantage of something like that. So let's not invest that money in a thing that's buzzy and exciting. And so that's again, like having that data, having that clarity allows you to make better business decisions. But I think also, kind of come to those C-suite meetings on par with with your own kind of data and analysis.
Yeah. That's a good point you make, because it's so if you're the third person to present, so as you said, finance gets up, they're giving you all those kinds of numbers, marketing gets up, gives you all those kind of numbers, and then HR gets up. And if you're not using the language of that room, you're going to be lost, and it's just an HR kind of conversation. So I want to go to the last one I want to cover before we close out is the house that data built. Whoa. Analytics. Kind of synced into our prior conversation. What are the numbers behind it? How effective is it? Can you give us some insights, some key points from that chapter? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, look, you can't talk about modern HR without talking about people analytics, right? Like that's one of the more fundamental and transformational components of modern HR. And one of the things I distinguish in the chapter is, we've always had metrics, we've always had reporting. Right? Like that's not new to HR. We've been doing that since we had, Excel spreadsheet back in the day.
And nobody read it.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody read it. But now we have analytics, and through those analytics, we have insights. In best-in-class organizations, we have predictive indicators of things that will happen before they've happened. Like, wow, like that's transformative for business. If you can understand how a particular program or a particular event is going to impact the employee, turnover, morale, whatever, before it even happens, talk about bringing business value to the organization. So, the chapter really gets into like how that evolution has shaped. And, one of the things that was important for me in the book, and especially in this chapter, is, there are certain chapters in the book where I personally go deep based on my experience. I've worked in that space for a long time. I have, lots of tangible examples and perspectives based on my own firsthand experience. There's others where I don't, but I know the people who are some of the leading thinkers in those disciplines are, and I brought them into the book to share their expertise. So, as it relates to people analytics, people like Josh Bersin, Al Adamson, David Green, those were some of the examples and stories and data and perspectives that I brought into the book, because those are some of the leading thinkers on the planet as it relates to people analytics. So I think it's really kind of laying the groundwork for how we used to think about things. Specific to Al and Josh Bersin, they both have their own kind of evolutionary framework for people analytics in terms of how we used to do things to how we do things now to how we're even going to do things in the future. And so really tangible examples in there that I think are helpful, not just to kind of help practitioners understand the landscape of people analytics today, but actually get into some specific practices of what companies are doing and how they're using that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Josh is an upcoming guest also, so thank you for giving that plug there. Let me ask you this, because I find the way that you broke the chapters down, and I mentioned this earlier, is there an assessment in each chapter that the practitioner could use to, in other words, pulse their organization as it relates to, say, transformational recruiting, that I can assess how well my recruiting function is, or the toolkit, or
there's not, and there's not actually by design. And I'll kind of walk you through my thinking. Like, I don't, and I talk about it early in the book around like this idea of best practices. I think best practices are BS. I don't believe in them, primarily because what will all the different indicators and variables that allow a practice to be successful in your specific organization are overall unique to you. The idea that you can replicate everything that you did and just port that to another organization and have the exact same results is unrealistic. Like we have, our company size, culture, geographies, team, budgets. There's an infinite amount of variables that allow something to be successful. And so I use the term proven practices, meaning it's proven to be successful in this organization. Doesn't mean it's going to work for you, but there's probably elements in what they do that you can take to your company and find success. So as it relates to benchmarking, I thought about that, but then I thought, like, what makes me the arbiter of what is considered best to benchmark against? And so I know other organizations do that, and that's kind of how they approach bodies of knowledge. For me personally, I didn't feel that it was my place to say, this is what you should be working towards. The book for me was more about saying, here are companies that are excelling in these different areas, and here's exactly how they do it. Hopefully you'll be able to take some things out of that to bring to your organization to level up your practices. But not to say, if you're not doing X, Y, and Z, you're doing it wrong. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I applaud you for mentioning that about best practices, because one of the questions I get in this region, I want to know what all the best practices are. And my way of defining that is that the DNA of the organization that uses that is totally different from the DNA of your organization.
Yeah.
And it's not scalable for the most part, and that's kind of, how I carry that forward. So
you're giving good advice.
Yeah. So that's because there's nothing, and you follow a lot of threads in Facebook and LinkedIn, and you see people asking about best practices, and I go, oh no, not again. And regardless of what you say, I give them the DNA story matching, and they still want the best practices. So, you do what you want to do. So, Lars, thank you so much for being a guest. Folks, if you're listening, here's the book. And, I was really kind of bummed out because I wanted to get mine when I was home over the holidays, but it didn't come out until after I left. So, and it's not on audible.com.
Yeah, not yet. That may be in the works. I will.
That may be in the works.
Yeah, that may be in the works.
Okay, I'm a big Audible fan. So thank you so much, Lars, for being a guest. So insightful. For people that's in the HR space, here's the level of thinking that we need to transform to, because the days of the legacy-driven organization, one of the things that COVID has taught us, the way that we did business before in HR, that's going to have to totally change. Because if you got to reimagine the workforce, reimagine the work model, we're going to have to come at it totally different. And Lars has a book that basically walks us through that. So Lars, thank you so much. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Well, Ron, thanks for having me on, and appreciate all the work you're doing to move us forward.
Okay. Thank you so much.